So, welcome to this short video on how to foster openness when you're giving feedback. It's part of the bigger program, How to Give Constructive Feedback That Works. I'm David Lee. So, feedback given poorly naturally triggers defensiveness and resistance. Think of your own experience when somebody gave you feedback in a way that you perceived as very negative, demeaning, etc. So what exactly constitutes poorly given feedback? Number one is using a tone of voice like an adult lecturing to or scolding a child. It reminds me of a version of mansplaining, to explain something to someone characteristically by a man to a woman, and a manner regarded as condescending or patronizing. So that's sort of like manager-splaining, or the manager-splaining version of that is that sort of patronizing, condescending, talking down to. So and you might be thinking, well, I would never do that. Well, I think that oftentimes we are so used to being treated a certain way that we inadvertently will do that to others. So it's worth paying attention to. Number two, explaining something they already know. This is something I'm really conscious of if I'm coaching somebody who's really smart, and not only not wanting them to feel talked down to, but also knowing how irritating it is for somebody to be taking time to, air quotes, explain something they already get. And especially if you're doing it with somebody who's pretty impatient. Number three, having a "this is how it is" overly certain position. I think sometimes people feel like if they sound super confident and super certain of their perspective, it gives them more credibility and minimizes the possibility of the other person disagreeing. And while it might increase the odds the person will avoid disagreeing with you, that's kind of an awkward way of saying it. While it might result in the person not wanting to disagree because it's just not worth the effort, they're so certain of their rightness, it also is a great way to trigger defensiveness, resistance, and resentment. So being conscious of both verbally and non-verbally communicating, hey, here's how I see it, but I'm also open, or I should say, and I'm also open to your feedback or your point of view. Number four, talking at, not with the other person. So where it's just this monologue, it's not a dialogue or a conversation. And you think about how frustrating that is for you, especially if you either don't understand where they're coming from, the rationale behind the other person's feedback, or you just flat out disagree with it. And so as the seconds maybe turn into minutes, your frustration and anger increases, and you want a chance to speak and say your point of view. Assuming agreement versus asking for their perspective. This is a big one I've noticed over the years, whether it's conducting seminars with managers or doing coaching, as oftentimes when I ask how they would bring up a particular issue, they might say something like, I would really like to see you respond in ways that demonstrate more empathy to our clients, our patients. And so let's work on a game plan to help you learn that. And the person might be thinking either A, I don't know why you say I don't show enough empathy, or B, they're like, I show plenty of empathy. You don't know what you're talking about. And so trying to get somebody to whip into action planning mode when they either don't understand or don't agree is a great way to trigger defensiveness and resistance. Trying to prevent disagreement versus inviting it. And this is where it really helps to have true confidence versus bravado or forced confidence. If you're really confident in your point of view, if you're really confident in who you are, you're willing to have the other person disagree, because if they disagree, it doesn't mean you're going to crumble. It doesn't mean you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I shouldn't have said that. It means, thankfully, they put their point of view on the table so you can discuss it, versus that plowing through monologue approach that oftentimes managers will take because they don't want to deal with conflict and disagreement. And yet the disagreement is there. It just goes underground and surfaces in passive aggressive or other resistant behaviors. So feedback given poorly naturally triggers defensiveness and resistance because, number one, if people don't want to feel like a child being scolded. Number two, whenever we give somebody feedback, there's a natural power differential. So for instance, let's say you go to a doctor and the doctor treats you in sort of a cold and different way. You're probably not going to say, "Hey doc, can I give you some feedback on your bedside manner?" And if you do, good for you, and you might want to say it in a slightly different way. But you think about that. Typically, feedback is something in the workplace that people with more power give to people with less power. And so it inherently doesn't feel good because of that. So anything that we can do to minimize that awkward power differential is a really good thing. And we'll talk more about how to do that. If feedback is given in a clumsy or ineffective way in the ways I mentioned before, a person feels misunderstood. And you think about your own experiences of feeling misunderstood and how horrible that feels. And the fourth is that feeling helpless, where if the person, in your opinion, misunderstands you, or in your opinion has a faulty perspective, and is also very unwilling to discuss it, they're very much in monologue mode, it creates this helpless feeling, this feeling like I can't say my point of view. I can't, defend myself here. And when we feel helpless, it triggers defensiveness. And that oftentimes also triggers aggressive behavior because it's like at a primal level, like an animal feeling backed into a corner. So how do we foster openness? Number one, be conscious of your voice tone. Is it adult to adult? Notice, and maybe even better yet, ask for feedback about your voice tone when you're giving somebody feedback. Ask like later to find out, do you sound like you're lecturing to your little kids? Or is there any sort of manager-splaining, talking down to patronizing tone of voice? And again, this is something I think that many adults have been treated like children in the workplace in terms of being given feedback or being reprimanded in some way. And then when they get to a position of power, they do the same thing to others. So we don't want to do that. Number two, being conscious of your verbiage to make sure it's adult to adult, or I oftentimes think of it as a coach to elite athlete. It's like a coach with an elite athlete. Each member of that dyad understands the other brings tremendous value to that relationship. And they need each other. Elite athlete's not going to perform as well as they can without a good coach, and there can't be a coach if there isn't an athlete to coach. So there's this mutual respect and recognition of the value they bring. And so having that mindset, and out of that mindset using, choosing words that communicate. We're two adults here. Number three is asking the person, do you know what I mean? So if you bring up some issue and give them feedback, don't just assume it's clear what you're saying. As you can ask, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm talking about? And each of these suggestions, you don't use them every single time. You use it in context. So if something's pretty blatantly obvious and it's, you wouldn't ask, do you know what I mean? But if there's potential for ambiguity, or your sense is it might be such new feedback for them that they might be confused by it or unclear. Number four, what's your take on this? I love using this. So here's my take on how you presented to the board of directors last night, X, Y, and Z. Here's how I think it might have been improved. What's your take on what I think I saw, or my perspective, or what's your take on the situation? Number five, how would you or how might you handle this differently if you had a do-over? Or how would you do it differently in the future? This is a great question to not only make it more interactive and a dialogue versus a monologue, but it also gives the feedback receiver a greater sense of control because they're not being talked at. They're not in this, I am now going to correct you, here's the deal interaction. It's we're working together and they get like first dibs, if you will, at identifying what could be improved upon. And when I used to be a manager of a team in a call center, and when I work in customer service environments, especially call centers, that's one of the things I always recommend in quality assurance or team leaders is to do that. And it helps, again, create that adult to adult, as well as fosters learning as part of everyday life. Number 6, when you're about to, quote, explain something, ask, why do you think it would be useful to do X? This is something I do a lot in coaching. So let me ask you, why would you ask them, why do you think it's useful to do X versus just explaining to do why X is a good thing? That's right. You're exactly right. It makes it more interactive, and it also isn't doing that, engaging in that tedious behavior of explaining something to somebody where they already know. And again, if it's somebody who's really smart, I believe they especially appreciate that. Number 7, this is kind of optional, that sometimes when I ask a person, especially if I'm coaching, why do you think it'd be useful to do such and such versus X versus Y, is I'll say, I'm not asking this to turn this into a pop quiz. It's so this is a conversation, not a monologue. Or sometimes I'll say, I'm not asking you this to, turn this into a pop quiz. I just don't want to be like talking at you versus, make this interactive. And if the person gets it wrong, like, hey, no biggie, then I might say, let's say it's not what I was thinking, but it's also a useful point. I just might simply say that, wow, that isn't what I was thinking, but actually that is another reason why, doing X, I'm sorry, that's actually, okay, I'm sort of messing this up. I'm actually doing back to number 6. If they answer why it's useful to do X, and it's not what I was thinking, I might say, wow, that's a great idea. That's another reason that I hadn't thought of. If they get it wrong, then I'll just say, I don't think that really fits here. And sometimes I'll joke, I go, but thanks for playing, just to, make it add a little humor to take away the sting in case there is any. Last but not least, as you look back on this, any other observations, either about what went well or what could have been improved upon? So again, notice it's making it interactive and it's making it adult to adult. Coach with elite athlete versus teacher, student, adult child. Okay, so there's some tips on how to foster openness and non-defensiveness to your feedback, and that's part of the bigger picture of how to give constructive feedback that works. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, or specific scenarios you'd like some feedback on, or for me to write an article or do a short video on. Also, you've got the LinkedIn URL there if you want to stay in touch. And also I have, I do posts regularly. And then also that resource page, lots of articles and some audio and video on various types of constructive conversations. So I hope you found the video helpful and hope to see you at a future event or hear from you. Take care.